My friends, welcome back to the channel and to a dark night here in my office. So I was just kind of sitting around and realized there's a video that I meant to make a long time ago and actually forgot to shoot in post. And that video is kinds of watches that I would avoid. Now, I know many years ago I did a couple videos of watches I would avoid and some I'd recommend. That was very broad and I was talking about particular brands that I didn't like at that point. And I wasn't as knowledgeable back then as I am now, so I don't know how accurate I would say those videos still are, especially now that they've aged a couple years. But there are a couple big tips and tricks that I definitely would say, like a top 5 list, which top 5s, top 10s seem to be what people want to watch anymore. I can definitely give you guys a top 5 list of watches or watch types that I would definitely avoid at all cost. So before we get into that, customary wristwatch check, of course. I know it's ironic since on this channel I sold all my Rolexes, went all Seiko, bought my Rolexes back, and have been all over the place. But today I am wearing one of my Rolexes. I'm wearing my Rolex Explorer 2. I love this thing, as you guys probably know if you've been watching me for a while. This to me is my favorite Rolex I've ever owned. It's slim, it's relatively rare, it's kind of unique looking for a Rolex, and I just love that polar dial. But this video is not about watches I would love and recommend. This video is about watches that I really would avoid at all costs. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll keep this a short, relatively short video. I know I like to talk. All right, so number 1, gold-plated watches. I see this happen all the time and it just irritates me. I see a lot of you guys out there, you're looking for, kind of an entry-level luxury watch. And, you might be looking at spending a couple $100. You can actually spend a couple $1,000, and especially if you're looking at some vintage pieces out there, a lot of you guys end up kind of wanting more of like a gold two-tone look, but you can't really afford the solid gold watches. And so what you're doing is you're settling for these gold-plated watches. And I'm here to tell you, avoid those kind of watches, because the reality is that plating, no matter how good it's done, and there are some ones that do last better than others, that plating is going to come off. And what's going to happen if it's not a cheap quality watch, if it's really cheap, the gold's going to come off and turn your wrist green. But if it's actually a decent quality process, it's just going to fade over time and get scratched. And you end up with a watch that looks like it belongs in the junkyard and not on your wrist. These are not long-term investments. I know some of you guys will go out there and you'll see, but it's a Tag Heuer and it's two-tone, or it's a Movado, or there's a couple brands that are really high offenders of these, especially some of their slightly older pieces. A lot of vintage watches, vintage Omegas, some of these watches too, same thing. I know some of you guys out there that watch me. Why'd I just do this? Sorry, that wasn't supposed to be a Trump thing, believe me. But there's a lot of that out there, and I know some of you guys actually really like the old gold-plated watches and the gold-filled watches. And older technology, that's just the way it was. And I know there's a market out there and you can definitely get it for a good deal. But if you're looking to buy something new and you think you're getting all the looks for less money and buying a gold-plated piece, don't do it. Because again, like I said, not only is it not going to hold up very well, the other thing is nobody really wants them. And when you go to sell it secondhand, they're next to worthless. Stainless steel watches, you're much better off just buying a plain stainless steel watch. And surprisingly, it's not actually just gold. There's other watches that have different kind of plating on them. PVD plating, see these watches that are stainless steel that they'll coat them in like black. Again, there's different things. Sometimes people paint these watches all sorts of weird colors. Any watch that's plated, that it's not like chemically permanently bonded to the metal, or it's not solid, like solid gold, don't do it. It's going to have low value, it's going to wear off over time, it's going to end up looking like absolute crap, and you're going to be wishing you would have saved your money and bought something nicer, or that you just bought in a plain stainless steel version, because it's just going to look like crap. And again, spend your money better other places. Speaking of crap, fashion quartz watches. First, let me point out the obvious. If you guys have been watching me for a while, especially in the last year, I'm about to give some advice that I've broken on my own, so feel free to make fun of me for being a little hypocritical on this. Don't buy cheap quartz fashion watches. And you know the ones I'm talking about. I would say Swatch is slightly outside of that, as they are meant to be disposable in their fashion, and I don't know quite how, I wouldn't put them into the same mold. You're buying that knowing what it is. But there's a lot of lower end luxury watches that are just cheap quartz watches that use, $5 or $10 Japanese movement and a stamped metal case, and you're paying way too much money for them. Now again, I am saying that I'm guilty of breaking this rule. As you guys may have seen, I bought my significant other a Skagen back in December. Why? Because I wasn't really sure if they were in the whole watch thing yet, and I wasn't ready to go shell out the money for a Nomos Tangente while I figured out whether or not this is going to be a long-term thing for them. So I'm going to take care of them with a proper Nomos in the future probably, but I was giving them a Skagen to kind of test the waters because it had a cool minimalist look, and I picked it up for a really good deal. So yes, I'm a hypocrite, but please bear with me even though I just admitted to being a hypocrite. You know, these watches out there, these MVTs, these Vinceros, oh God, I hate this crap so much. These are cheap, generic, mass-produced, market brand crap. In my humble opinion, the people that manufacture these watches may have different opinions than me. This is my personal opinion. And I think there are much better watches out there for the money. So if you're gonna go spend, you know, $70, $80, $100, $150, or God, heaven forbid, you know, $500 on a Movado Quartz or some of these other watches out there, think of all the other better watches you could be buying for the same money. Instead of spending $70 or $80 on some generic fashion watch, you could have had a mechanical Seiko. You could have had the Invicta Pro Diver. You could have spent a little bit more money. You could have gotten yourself, you know, some nice Citizen automatics, some nice Seiko automatics, some pre-owned Hamiltons, some pre-owned Tussauds. Lots of great stuff out there. And if you're gonna go spend $500 or more on a Movado, why not just buy a Hamilton or buy an automatic Tissot? I mean, why are you throwing your money away on these thin, cheaply made, by and large, don't hate me, watches that have, you know, $10 Japanese movements in them? There's just so much better stuff out there. And I see it all the time. You guys go, you find these stores that sell these watches and they're trendy. You want the Michael Kors watch, and of course a lot of those Michael Kors watches have the gold plating on them. It's gonna come off just like I told you. They're generic, they use generic movements in them, and they're a watch you're gonna throw away in 2 or 3 years when the battery needs to get swapped out. And again, why are you buying this stuff? Save your money, buy yourself something nice, buy yourself something with a mechanical movement, buy yourself something that you're gonna have for more than 5 years. You know, maybe you have something you could have for 10 or 15 years, or if you buy something really nice, it could last you your lifetime. Don't buy this stuff that's gonna be disposable. Number 3 that I would avoid, kind of the counterpoint to this, is don't buy something that's gonna be more expensive than you can afford to have. So, you know, there's kind of this thing in the car world too. I see people all the time getting themselves into really bad car decisions, and this ties into the point I'm gonna make about watches. There are a plethora of 3 or 4 year old, you know, Mercedes-Benz S-Classes and BMW 7 Series and Audi A8s, and I see kids all the time buying used M3s and M5s for $25,000, $30,000 that are, you know, 10 years old, and they're like, oh, I got a great deal and I got a lot of car and it's awesome, and then the second something blows up, they're bankrupt. And just like that with cars, don't think you're gonna get away with buying an expensive complication watch for a good price, not being able to pay for the maintenance down the road. You gotta think about these things. You know, if you're gonna go out there and buy a 10-year-old or 15-year-old BMW SMG M5 with a V10, your SMG pump goes out, you're looking at a massive repair bill, you're in big trouble right now. Same thing with watches. You know, there's some Audemars Piguets out there and other ones that are, you know, top tier brand, high complication watches that can be picked up for a couple $1,000s. And I know people that go out there and they're like, why am I gonna go buy, you know, an Omega or a Rolex if I could have an Audemars? And, or there's even some higher complication, you know, like even like Jaeger-LeCoultres or Jaeger-LeCoultre, because I know somebody's gonna smack me for my pronunciation. Be aware of the service that you're buying into. They're great watches, they really are. And you know, I think they're wonderful, but you got to understand that you're signing up for an economic liability that you need to be able to be prepared to handle. And if you're going to freak out, if you get a plus $1,000 service bill on one of these watches, you really shouldn't be buying them. And that's something a lot of people don't seem to understand. You go out and buy one of these high complication used Audemars, guess what? It's not going to be $250 a service at your local watchmaker. It's going to be a 4-figure plus service contract on that thing when it needs to get serviced. And don't sign yourself up for that without knowing what you're getting into. And again, if you're looking at buying one of these luxury cars, just because you can afford it used, if you can't afford to service it new, I probably would look the other way on some of those cars as well. So again, don't buy cheap quality watches or cheap fashion watches. Flip side, don't buy high complication watches you can't afford to service, because you're signing up for some hurt and pain down the road there. Speaking of service nightmares, vintage watches. I've talked about this on my channel before. We live in an amazing age where we can find all sorts of cool vintage rare watches from all around the world. You know, we can buy them from halfway across the planet. I mean, I can go on eBay or a plethora of other websites. I keep saying plethora for some reason. And I can have my fair take of all sorts of vintage Grand Seikos and vintage JLCs and vintage Rolexes. And there's just all these cool watches out there. But you got to be really, really careful. So let's say you've done a good job and you haven't found one of these Frankenstein monster watches where somebody took a bunch of vintage parts and cobbled them together with fake parts or aftermarket parts or new parts and created a Frankenstein watch. Let's say you actually bought a watch that's actually in really good condition, it's been really well taken care of, it's got box and papers, and you made a really good deal. What happens when you need to service that watch? I'm speaking from experience from this because I have one of those watches that I know is going to be impossible to service if it ever breaks. I'm talking about my vintage Pierce chronograph, a watch that would cost more to service and fix than the watch is worth. This watch was given to me and I love it, and it's a part of me and I'm going to keep it forever. But bear in mind, you go out and buy one of these vintage watches out there, especially some of these older Grand Seikos and some of these higher end watches, it's not, you can't just walk into any store and get anybody to work on it. Not every watchmaker can touch it, and certainly not every watchmaker can find parts for it. So you really got to understand too, I mean, it's like buying a vintage car. I'm going to keep going back to car analogies because I just love cars so much. If you're looking at an Auburn Speedster or a Duesenberg or a Mercedes 300 SL, you can't just go to your local dealership and be like, hey guys, I need you to do a service for me. You gotta go out and find specialists, and you have to wait, you know, weeks, months, potentially even years sometimes to find parts to fix one of these things. And so it's part of the lifestyle of owning a watch like this, and just something you really have to keep in mind. So again, number 4, be careful when you're buying, be careful when you're buying these vintage watches. Understand what you're signing up for and the potential of what's unfolding in terms of service down the road. And last but not least, I talked about this a little bit on my watch collection mistakes, and it's a mistake that I've made so many times, I figured I'd bring it up again here too, which is buying watches that are too small for you. This ties really well to vintage watches because a lot of vintage watches, especially men's watches, are a lot smaller than they are today. It's not uncommon to find men's watches of 30 millimeter, 32 millimeter, 34 millimeter. Heck, Rolex makes 34 millimeters. I mean, the Air Kings, there's modern Rolex Air Kings that are 34 mil. There's lots of watches that are 36 millimeter. I've owned several Datejust. Rolex makes a bunch of 36 millimeter watches. I would still wear them. A lot of guys would still wear them, but for now, a lot of people, 36 is small. And for most modern men, I'm willing to bet a lot of you guys would be uncomfortable wearing a 28 for sure, or a 30 or 32 millimeter watch. And so it's really easy to find one of these vintage pieces that's got a great price tag on it, and you think, oh, it's a little bit smaller, but I'll make it work, only to find out that when you get it, it's not something you're gonna wanna be wearing every day. You know, I've mentioned recently on other videos, I had a vintage JLC, a solid gold watch, Art Deco, beautiful watch. I gotta find pictures of it. It's in some of my really old videos. Gorgeous watch, the movement was spectacular, but the watch was so small, I was really self-conscious wearing it because it looked like a women's watch. And you know, gender norms and all that's a whole other topic I need to get into. I mean, why we think about that and why it emasculates us and stuff is a whole other goofy thing to think about. But the reality is I wasn't comfortable wearing it. We'll just leave it there. And so it's one of those things that, again, you might find a good price on it, but make sure it's a size you're willing to wear. I mean, you know, nowadays, you know, my Explorer 2, this is 40 millimeters. This is, to me, one of my favorite sizes. A lot of women are wearing 40 millimeter watches these days too, which is great. So women's watches are typically smaller than men. So the fact that women are comfortable wearing, you know, 37, 38, 39, 40 millimeter watches, and men's watches are more averaging 43, 44, 45 now, you got to think twice about buying some of these vintage size watches out there, because you may not be so happy with them when they show up and you realize they're a little bit smaller than you thought they were. So that was number 5. I haven't really counted these things out, but there you go. So again, number 1, avoid the gold-plated stuff. Number 2, avoid the cheap fashion watches. Number 3, avoid the high complication stuff you can't afford. Number 4, avoid vintage watches where you can't find the parts to. And number 5, be careful of the size of the watches you're buying. So I was gonna keep this short. I got animated and went on too long. So hopefully you guys found this helpful. As always, thank you guys so much for tuning in and for watching. I really appreciate your support. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. I try to read all your comments as much as I can. I really appreciate them. Let me know what you guys think below. What did I leave out? What do you disagree with? What would you recommend? Please let me know. I genuinely do read them and I genuinely do appreciate them. If you haven't already, please subscribe and check out other videos on my channel because you're probably gonna like them. And again, guys, it's a blessing to be here. It's a blessing you guys all watch me. I really appreciate it. Stay tuned and I'll catch you guys on the next video. Catch you later.